Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of History Discussion. I am an American narrator bringing you a fresh perspective on a pivotal chapter in US and Vietnamese history, the Battle of Khe Sanh, early 1968. Today's part dives into the lead-up to the siege and the strategic rationale on both sides. We begin in early 1961 when the US began pouring advisors, weapons, and aid into South Vietnam to bolster the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The goal to build so-called strategic hamlets, modeled after successful Philippine counterinsurgency efforts. But these hamlets failed. Vietnamese peasants were reluctant to abandon their ancestral villages and daily traditions, turning those protected settlements into virtual open-air prisons rather than thriving communities. That misstep eventually forced the US to transition from strategic hamlets to full-scale conventional warfare. On March 8, 1965, American troops started landing in Gia Nung. Over the next few years, US troop levels swelled to nearly 1 million, including Allied contributions. By contrast, ARVN forces numbered around 200,000, with far less equipment and training. Facing such disparity, President Le Duan and North Vietnamese strategy emphasized a war of endurance, forced the U.S. to fight a long war until domestic pressures eroded American resolve. By late 1967, U.S. commanders were concerned about a potential repeat of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. General Westmoreland believed that Khe Sanh Combat Base, established near the Laos border as early as 1962, could serve as a vital strategic point, both to watch PAVN movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and to anchor U.S. defenses south of the DMZ. Starting January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces, estimated at 2 to 4 divisions, laid siege to Khe Sanh, closing Route 9 and disrupting U.S. supply lines. This coincided with North Vietnam's broader Tet Offensive, which detonated across South Vietnam's cities simultaneously. Historians debate whether the siege was meant as a real attempt to seize Khe Sanh or a diversion to draw U.S. forces away from urban centers. Under intense bombardment, the base's defenders, 6,000 Marines supplemented by ARVN and U.S. Army units, relied heavily on air power. Operation Niagara launched the largest sustained bombardment in history, with nearly 40,000 tons of bombs dropped between January and April, while Marine and Air Force aviation flew over 16,000 sorties themselves. The base was never completely cut off thanks to the innovative use of helicopters and LAPS low-altitude parachute delivery from C-130s. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese kept up artillery and mortar assaults on outposts like Hill 861 and the Lang Vây Special Forces Camp, taking several positions, though never overrunning the main base. In mid-March, U.S. launched Operation Pegasus, an overland relief that cleared Route 9 and lifted the siege by April 8th. In the immediate aftermath, U.S. forces declared Khe Sanh a tactical success and evacuated the base. By June 19th, the base was dismantled. Final withdrawal occurred on July 5, 1968. North Vietnamese claimed a political victory. They drew away a large share of U.S. troops during Tet and exposed the unsustainability of America's war strategy. Strategic analysts have argued that Khe Sanh functioned as a diversion. By fixing U.S. forces to the border region, it allowed the VC to strike in urban centers more successfully. In effect, General Giap used Khe Sanh as a strategic distraction, or what's known as an option play. The U.S. responded with massive firepower and held the base, but at the cost of overlooking the bigger Tet campaign unfolding in cities like Saigon and Hue. Picking up where we left off, let's examine the aftermath of the Battle of Khe Sanh and its impact on both American and Vietnamese strategy, and how it still shapes the way we think about the Vietnam War today. After the siege ended in April 1968, U.S. military leaders initially hailed the defense of Khe Sanh as a victory. General Westmoreland and his staff emphasized that, despite being heavily outnumbered, American and ARVN forces had held the base under intense bombardment, inflicted significant casualties, and never allowed the North Vietnamese to capture it. For a moment, it seemed like a demonstration of U.S. resolve and the effectiveness of air power and logistics in the face of adversity. However, that tactical success didn't translate to a clear strategic win. In fact, by July 1968, just a few months after the siege was lifted, U.S. forces abandoned and destroyed the Khe Sanh combat base. The official reason was that its strategic value had diminished and that holding it required too many resources, especially as North Vietnamese forces could simply shift their operations elsewhere. But the withdrawal raised tough questions for the American public and policymakers. After investing so much blood and treasure, why give it up? Was it really worth it? Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese leaders and General Giap, looking back on the campaign, viewed Khe Sanh not as a loss, but as a critical element of their overall Tet offensive strategy. By drawing U.S. troops and attention to Khe Sanh, they managed to divert resources away from urban centers, where simultaneous attacks shocked both South Vietnam and America. The attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, symbolically considered the White House of the East, made international headlines, even though the attackers were quickly repelled. For many Americans watching on television, it created a perception that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, despite years of U.S. involvement. Inside the United States, the impact was profound. The Tet Offensive and the Khe Sanh episode within it shattered the illusion that the war was nearing a successful end. The American media broadcast dramatic footage and raised tough questions. If the enemy could launch such coordinated attacks, and if our bases, even a heavily fortified one like Khe Sanh, were vulnerable, then what was the endgame? President Johnson's administration faced growing anti-war sentiment, and public confidence in official reports began to erode. Strategically, the events of 1968 forced a major shift in American policy. Johnson halted the bombing of North Vietnam and announced he would not seek re-election. The Vietnamization policy was accelerated, aiming to hand more responsibility to the South Vietnamese army while gradually reducing U.S. troop involvement. Yet, the psychological effect of Khe Sanh and Tet was lasting. They revealed the limits of American military power in an environment where political will, not just firepower, would decide the outcome. For the North Vietnamese, the 1968 campaigns achieved several goals. They demonstrated to their own people and to the world that they could challenge U.S. power, disrupted American strategy, and ultimately pushed the U.S. closer to negotiation and withdrawal. Although North Vietnam also paid a high price in casualties, the political victory was undeniable. America was no longer confident in victory, and that changed everything. As we look back on Khe Sanh, historians now see it as more than just a siege. It was a symbol of the Vietnam War's contradictions: overwhelming American technology versus Vietnamese determination, battlefield victories that didn't lead to strategic success, and a war that, ultimately, was decided as much by politics and will as by guns and bombs. So here's the question. In the end, did the United States and its allies really understand the true nature of the conflict they were fighting? And how did Vietnamese strategy continue to evolve after Khe Sanh in ways that kept surprising American commanders? To find out how the Vietnamese continued to outmaneuver U.S. technology and tactics, and what happened in the next chapters of the war, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for future episodes of History Discussion. Don't miss our next deep dive into the secret moves that shaped the outcome of the entire war.